Thinking Aloud from the University of Warwick.
Hi, this is Christian Smith with Thinking Aloud of the University of Warwick. This is part 2 of a series exploring the influence of William Shakespeare's plays on the development of Karl Marx's and Sigmund Freud's work. In this video, I'm interested in uncovering the features of Marx's personal and intellectual life that contributed to his engagement with Shakespeare. I am also interested in the social historical context of Marx's life that made Shakespeare available and attractive to him. Over his 40-year professional writing career as a philosopher, journalist, economist, historian, and revolutionary leader, Marx quoted from or alluded to 29 of Shakespeare's plays for a total of at least 166 citations. Sometimes the allusions were as simple as calling someone the very Polonius of political economy, or exclaiming, "Aye, there's the rub." However, many of the quotes and allusions are significant in the development of his theory. There is a reciprocal intertextual relationship between Marx's writings, in which he uses Shakespeare, and the plays themselves. The plays gave Marx's writings a literary flavor and form. For example, his second most Shakespearean book, Capital, Volume 1, uses Shakespeare's plays and other world literature to make it read as if it were a tragedy. Reciprocally, Marx's use of Shakespeare constructs a specific reading of the plays. For example, Marx reads The Merchant of Venice not as a comedy, but as a tragedy, in which all of the characters are involved in antagonistic, alienated relationships. There is, however, a more striking finding that is emerging from this research, and that is that Shakespeare was not only a resource for Marx, but also a formative influence on Marx. In Marx's writings in the development of consciousness and in his economic writings, it is evident that he was influenced by Shakespeare's conceits about consciousness and money. Arguments articulated by some of Shakespeare's characters form the backbone of some of Marx's theories. In one case, it was found that arguments in an article written by Marx in which he quoted The Merchant of Venice followed the same methodological steps as did the argument in the play's trial. Marx understood that all people are influenced by circumstances encountered from the past. He would not have been surprised that he was influenced by the very substantial contribution of Shakespeare to German intellectual development. In fact, Shakespeare himself was influenced by classical thinkers writing long before him. Shakespeare took their ideas, read them in a certain way, and wrote them into his plays, transforming not only the ideas from the past, but the reading of those ideas in the future. Karl Marx repeated the process of influence, interpretation, and transformation. However, this position is not universally supported. One reason for this is that the contribution of Shakespeare to Marx's writings is not always clearly indicated. Indeed, in this video you will see evidence of how an important Marx's book does not completely reference Shakespeare's influence to it. In the first part of this series, I interviewed Shakespearean critic and biographer Jonathan Bate about the reasons why Shakespeare might have been an influence on Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. In this video, I will talk with Marx scholar and biographer David Mclellan to discuss Marx's engagement with William Shakespeare. Hello, I'm here with Professor of Political Theory and Marx biographer David Mclellan. He is the author of Karl Marx, His Life and Thought, as well as editor of many of Marx's writings, such as the Grundrisse. We will be looking at the influence of William Shakespeare on Karl Marx. Thank you for talking with me today.
My pleasure.
Let's begin by establishing a setting for the formative development of Karl Marx's thinking. Where and when was Marx born? What were the conditions of this place at this time, and how might those conditions have influenced the developing Marx?
Yes, well, Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, which is now in Germany, but I think the important thing is to realize that this is in the Rhineland, and the Rhineland had been conquered by France, revolutionary France, with Napoleon sweeping eastwards, and therefore this particular bit of Germany was very much imbued with Enlightenment thought, ideas of rationality, liberalism, liberty, fraternity, equality, all that sort of thing, unlike a lot of Germany, particularly Prussia, which was fairly reactionary. So Marx was brought up in that sort of intellectual climate, which is, as I say, part of the Enlightenment and part of the kind of contemporary inheritance of Europe, rather than the kind of reactionary bit of the rest of Prussia. And this Enlightenment, rationalism, interest in freedom and equality remained with him for the rest of his life.
How did Marx come about? How did it come about that Marx was introduced to Shakespeare's plays?
Well, this fortunately is fairly clear to us, because I think it's his daughter Eleanor says in a small biography of her father that when he was a teenager and he was then a fiancé of a very aristocratic Scottish German young woman, Jenny von Westphalen, and Jenny von Westphalen's father, that is the Baron, aristocratic von Westphalen, took very much to the young Marx, and Eleanor tells us that the Baron, whereas his father, Marx's father, read Voltaire and Racine, which is this kind of Enlightenment inheritance, the Baron read Shakespeare and Homer with him, which Eleanor says remained his favourite authors for the rest of his life. I think that's not true about Homer, but I think it is true about Shakespeare.
Do we have a sense of where they read this? Was it something they studied together? Was it something they spoke about on walks?
Exactly the latter, on walks, from what we gather. That the Baron went on long walks with the young Karl Marx, and talked to him about Shakespeare and this kind of thing. They may have read it at home as well, but certainly on their long walks around Trier, along the Moselle River, definitely.
Did Marx read the plays, or did he see them in the theater? What do we know about Marx's theater attendance, both in Germany and then later on in his life in London?
We know very little about this. I suspect that he read these plays, and that was all. There's no, as far as I know, evidence of his going to the theatre in the 1840s, 50s and 60s when he was living in London, partly because he was probably too poor. But anyway, in the last decade of his life, because all his family, including his daughters, particularly Jenny and Eleanor, were very, very keen on Marx, it is recorded both that his daughters were members of Shakespeare societies in London. We're thinking about the late 1870s and early 1880s at this moment, and also that in the Marx household, because Marx was better off during the last decade of his life and had a decent large house there, they would actually put on Shakespeare plays there.
Really?
And she says, Eleanor, that at one point, that he was a very good spectator of this, and he enjoyed them enormously, and sometimes in the comedy or the tragedy, you could see tears rolling down his face, so much he appreciated these things. But I think, with regard to actually looking at these plays and going to the theatre, it's probably only the last decade, let's say, of his life that he actually did that.
Okay. Let's look at the influence of Aristotle on Marx. We know that Aristotle's writings influenced some of Shakespeare's plays. His thoughts on money can be seen influencing Timon of Athens and The Merchant of Venice. His thoughts on the relationship of art and nature form a backdrop to much of Shakespeare's work. Aristotle is mentioned by name in one of his plays, Troilus and Cressida. We also know that Aristotle was very popular in Germany during the time that Marx was growing up. For example, in the University of Berlin, there was a center of Aristotelian thought. How much of an influence did Aristotle's work have on Karl Marx? Can you give some examples of places in Marx's writings where he displays Aristotle's influence or where he grapples with Aristotelian concepts?
Yes, well, this is, needless to say, quite a controversial question. And although you say that Aristotle was an important figure in the University of Berlin, where Marx was a student and did his undergraduate and postgraduate work. There is no doubt that the predominant influence there was not Aristotle at all, it was Hegel. Nevertheless, I think you're right in saying that Marx paid quite a lot of attention to Aristotle, more particularly, I think, in his later writings. You ask for an example. An example, I think, would be in the very beginning of Marx's Das Kapital. A few pages in, he has a whole page on Aristotle where Marx is thinking of the question of value. And he's saying Aristotle is the first person really to have seriously posed this question of what is there that makes objects commensurable in terms of value. And Aristotle's example is a house equals 5 beds or something like that. And Marx is saying, well, does Aristotle arrive at the answer as to how these things can be commensurable in terms of value? And Marx's answer is no, he doesn't. And the reason he doesn't is that Aristotle lived in a society where labour was not sort of equal and commensurable, because it was a slave society, and slave labour has no value really. Whereas Marx's theory, famous labour theory of value, comes from the idea that the commensurability between these two things, the house and the 5 beds, is due to the amount of human labour which is incorporated in each one of them. So he says that although Aristotle poses the question rightly, he's not in a position, because of the society he lived in, to arrive at the right answer. But there's no doubt at all that Marx in his later writings had a very considerable respect for Aristotle.
What about the formative influence of classical dramatic works on Marx? For example, Homer, Sophocles, Aristophanes, or Ovid. Was there an influence of classical dramatic works on Marx?
I think it's very difficult to answer that question. It is true that, again, according to, I think, one of his daughters, that Marx used to read the plays of Aeschylus, the 7 plays of Aeschylus that survive, every year.
Every year.
And was particularly keen on the Agamemnon, and indeed that whole trilogy. But I think it's almost impossible to say that these sorts of writings had a direct influence upon his work, in partly because the work of Marx is, well, it's not exactly empirical, but it's in political economy. Now, there are ways of expressing his works, and of course he does use, and maybe we'll come on to this, various sorts of ways, metaphors or ways of expressing things, which obviously he's gained from his very profound knowledge of literature. But I think when we come to Homer, even Aeschylus, Sophocles, he quotes from time to time, Ovid, he quotes from time to time. These are simply to make, they're adjuncts to his main idea. They're not formative of his theory at all.
Okay. Goethe and Schiller used Shakespeare's challenge to the classical rules of drama as one of the routes to grow the German Romantic movement, which then became a challenge to French classicism and helped the Germans establish their own identity. Is there an influence of this German Romanticism on Marx's writings?
I think very much so, particularly in his early writings. It seems to me quite clear, and particularly, and possibly Goethe, but mainly Schiller. Not so much Schiller's poetry, I think, but Schiller's work, the letters on aesthetic education, which form a kind of backdrop to Marx's Paris writings, which have been extremely influential. Schiller here, as a romantic, and there are a lot of people writing in Germany along these sorts of lines, is opposed to the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and is in that sense reactionary, looking back to medieval times and saying things were better then, and education was better then, and people were not so stunted, and it was people were capable of producing all-round individuals of one sort or another. And it is that I think Marx is harking back to a very large extent in his early writings, to that kind of romantic movement, led, in his view, by Schiller.
Okay. What about Heinrich Heine? Heinrich Heine wrote literary criticism of Shakespeare's plays, focusing on questions of social justice. Through his relationship to Karl Marx, he may have been an influence for Marx's readings of the plays. Can you tell us something about the relationship between Marx and Heine?
Yes, I can tell you something about the relationship, about the reading of the plays. We don't have any evidence about that, alas. But while Marx was writing his early writings, the famous Paris manuscripts in Paris in 1844, Heine was one of the very frequent visitors to the Marx household. And one of the ideals that Marx holds up in these early writings is that socialist form of society could produce a human individual who was, as he calls it in his German, allseitige, all-rounded, a completely all-rounded individual. And I think, though I've never seen this said anywhere else, that the main model for this human individual, this all-rounded individual, was probably his friend Heine. Because for him, Heine was somebody who was all-rounded, as you say. He wrote this, he wrote that, he wrote that. He was a very all-round kind of individual. And I think when we see this, this kind of communist man, as it were, the person of the future in Marx's early writings, that Heine, who was very intimate with Marx and the whole household for about a whole year, while Marx was writing these very important early manuscripts, these 1844 manuscripts.
Let's take a look now at the very controversial Jewish question. Both Shakespeare and Marx's works have contributed to the Jewish question. Shakespeare's most significant contribution to the issue is the character of Shylock. This is also one of the most frequently alluded to Shakespearean characters in Marx's writings. How do you interpret Marx's contribution to the Jewish question, possibly in light of his use of Shylock in his essay on the Jewish question and scattered references to Jews throughout his writings?
Yes, again, of course, this is this is a fairly controversial question. Let me just begin by saying his most extensive comment on this, on the Jewish question, is an answer to one of his colleagues, Bruno Bauer, who had suggested that the Jewish question in Germany at the time could be solved by giving Jews equal rights in the German state. And Marx is at pains to say that giving equal rights to people is not a sufficient solution to the problems of society, because they lie deeper than simply political things. They lie deeper in economic, social and economic areas, and so you need to probe deeper than. So that's the origin. But as he goes on, Marx takes in the same essay on the Jewish question, written in 1843, to produce remarks about what he called Judentum, Jewishness, which sound to the modern ear extremely anti-Semitic. Now, there's a certain amount of discussion about whether, Judentum is something which is a kind of metaphorical use for extreme forms of capitalism and money making and that kind of thing. And it's not particularly against the Jews. So people's opinions divide upon this. I'm more in favour of seeing Marx as not especially anti-Semitic in this particular writing, though there are people who disagree with this quite profoundly. With regard to his later writings and his references to Shylock and so forth, it is true that Marx indulges, particularly with his friend Friedrich Engels, in fairly kind of racist remarks of one sort or another, including things which are vaguely anti-Semitic, particularly with regard to their friend Ferdinand Lassalle. But what I think about that is that these were, well, this extends way into the 20th century. These sorts of remarks were par for the course of the time. It doesn't show that people were particularly racist. It simply shows that people adopted the kind of language and possibly attitude, certainly the language which are current among their sorts of strata of society at the time, and that's all there is to be said about it. You know, you can say the same thing about, I don't know, John Buchan or somebody, you know, or even possibly Dorothy Sayers. But so, you know.
Okay, thank you. Marx quoted from Shakespeare's play Timon of Athens in all of his economic writings. Could you first outline the timeline and organization of Marx's economic writings, and then tell us how did Timon's soliloquies about money fit into those writings?
Yes, well, the most prominent of these is in what I mentioned already, that is the 1844 manuscripts, where he has a long quotation from Timon of Athens about money, you know, and here he's, in those manuscripts, he's thinking about the notion of alienation, that is, how the products of human activity, although they're products of human activity, eventually come to dominate them. His prime example of that is religion, where men, according to him, invent the idea of God, and then God comes to dominate them. But he's more interested, much more interested in economic matters here, and he thinks that money, which is after all, in a way, a human invention, has come, you know, because of its importance and people chasing after it all the time, to vitiate a human existence, you know, and therefore that money and the whole economic system needs a profound reorganization in order to produce the kind of person that, according to me, he thought Heinrich Heine embodied there. And that's why there he introduces this long passage from Timon of Athens to demonize, in a way, money as an alienating aspect of human existence. Now, as Marx went on, he, and we might come to this later, some people think that he rejected these early philosophical, very Hegelian, fairly humanist, not particularly empirical in the sense of, you know, tiny little analyses of what was actually going on in the area, in favour of something which is much more empirical, and that this break came in 1845, and later on in writings like Capital particularly, that he produced something which was much more well, in a way, down to earth, or less humanist. Now, I don't think that that is true, and we can come on to that maybe later on.
It's a good time to talk about that. Go ahead. Was there an epistemological break in Marx?
I mean, partly because I think that quite recently, I mean over the last 50-odd years, not more than that, Marx's drafts for Capital, written in the late 1850s, Capital was published in 1867, Volume 1, have shown that there's kind of a bridge between these early writings and the later writings, where he employs some of the same vocabulary, does, and the same notions of alienation and the domination of human beings by the objects that they themselves have created, and that therefore between the early Marx of 1844 and the later one of Capital later on, I think there is a continuity rather than a break. Now this again is a very controversial notion, and particularly the French philosopher and Marxist Louis Althusser was the most famous scholar of Marx, who said there is a complete break in 1845 and 1846, and there's no... and Marx, in as far as Marx had these little Hegelian bits and pieces later in his work, these must be expunged to produce a correct theory of everything, really. But as I say, I don't agree with that. You know.
It's interesting to me that, for me, one of his most empirical works is Capital, published in 1867. Yet it is also one of his most Shakespearean works, in the sense that he quotes, it's the second most quoted, Shakespearean quoted book after Herr Vogt.
Yes, I've just been looking up in the Penguin edition of Volume 1 of Capital, which has got an extremely good index in it, and it quotes Ovid and it quotes Aeschylus. There's no reference to Shakespeare whatsoever in that, you know.
Yes.
So, although I'm sure what you say is true,
yes.
You know, I think the evidence, I mean, that in sense of empirical evidence for Shakespeare popping up in Marx's empirical works is extremely scanty.
It's very interesting that in, for example, in the Ben Folks translation,
That's that one. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
there is no in the index or in the references. There's no Shakespeare in there, and yet there are 10 instances in the book.
Yeah.
So there was some disconnect between what was actually written in the book and, in the case of Shakespeare, what was placed in the index. That was interesting to me.
Yes. Well, I can't comment on that because I haven't, I've looked up the index and thought, well, I'll look up what it says about Shakespeare there, but I haven't been able to find anything.
Yeah.
Now,
Interesting.
according to you, and I'm sure you're right, I would be able to find quite a lot here if I looked. But I suspect it would be like Ovid or Aeschylus. You'd find references to this kind of thing, but they don't inform the way, it don't inform his theory at all. His theory is not what Shakespeare is. This is political economy, come on, it's not King Lear.
Right. At this point, I would like to show Capital, Volume 1. This is the Penguin edition, translated by Ben Folks. And in this edition, if we come to the back of the book, to the index, and we look for Shakespeare, we don't find him. We find Shaftesbury, we find Sheepwalks. There is a section of the book called Index of Authorities Quoted, and it is in here where we can find the world literature. For example, here we see Sophocles, Antigone. Here we see Virgil, the Aeneid. Strangely, though, if we look for Shakespeare, we don't find him. Here's Sextus Empiricus, here's Cyber Nicolai Sismondi, and then we're on to the case. He's not listed here. One would think that Shakespeare did not contribute any quotes to this work. And yet, here I have 11 quotes from Shakespeare. Quotes or allusions to Shakespeare. In the first one, from Henry IV, Marx writes, "The objectivity of commodities as values differs from gain quickly in the sense that a man knows not where to have it." Now, the quote is listed down here on page 138. If we come over here to page 177, this is at the end of the very critical chapter on the fetishism of commodities. Marx ends it in what seems like a humorous reading: "To be a well-favored man is a gift of fortune, but reading and writing comes by nature." And this is from Much Ado About Nothing. The third time that Marx uses Shakespeare is here in the section on money, where he says, "We see that commodities are in love with money, but," quote, "the course of true love never did run smooth," end quote. This is not in the index. It's also not listed here as coming from Shakespeare. However, Marx has speech marks on either side, so he did get it from somewhere, and we know that it comes from Helena's speech in A Midsummer Night's Dream. This is a more famous quote here. This is from Timon of Athens, "Gold, yellow, glittering, precious gold," which he has about 20 lines of this on these two pages right here. The next one we find here is from Macbeth, also not listed anywhere in the index or here in the footnotes, in which he says, "Suddenly, however, there arises the voice of a worker which had previously been stifled in the sound and fury of the production process." On this page here, we have a name from Hamlet, in which Marx says, Arthur Young, he calls him the statistical prattler Arthur Young, the Polonius of political economy. Here is our first quote from The Merchant of Venice, in which there are a few, in which Marx is talking about the working day and the particular viciousness of the working day. He says, "Workers and factory inspectors protested on hygienic and moral grounds, but capital answered, My deeds upon my head, I crave the law, the penalty and forfeit of my bond. A few lines later, I, his breast, so says the bond. Again, we have Marx using a quote from Much Ado, in which he talks about the dogberries, the provincial dogberries. Here we have the next one from The Merchant of Venice, and in this case, the working class is used as in the metaphor with Shylock, where he quotes, "You take my life when you do take the means whereby I live," from Act 4, Scene 1 of The Merchant of Venice. Our 10th quote is again, or our 10th allusion is again from Much Ado, in which he talks about the buffoonery of the English dogberries. Sometimes these are simple insults that he throws at people. Sometimes there's much more depth to them, as there is with the Merchant of Venice one. And finally, he talks about, it is of course the fashion amongst the Shylocks of the aristocracy to shrug one's shoulders pharisaitically at the building speculators and the small landlords of the open villages, using Shylock as a metaphor for the people who don't care about the rights of these tenants. If we look at the German edition of this book, Das Kapital, Erster Band, we notice, first of all, that Shakespeare is here in the index. He is also in the index of authorities quoted, which is where he should have been in there. Shakespeare, William, and we've got the different plays, Der Kaufmann von Venedig, König Henrik the Theater, and so on. Even the Midsummer Night's Dream one, on page 122 of this book, that is not listed at all in this book, is in the German edition, recognized in the German edition. This book here is put out by Karl Verlag in Berlin. Das Kapital.
Let's take a look at Marx's insults. He loved to insult people. His writings are filled with biting satire. He wrote an entire book called Herrfot, in which he has an extended metaphor of this gentleman, Karl Vogt, being Falstaff, the fat knight from Henry IV, and other plays.
Yes.
What was the significance of Marx's insults? What was he doing with them? How did they serve him?
Well, I have not any privileged insight into Marx's character, and it may well have been that he was just revenging himself upon people who thought it had insulted him. And you're absolutely right. He really goes quite over the top in more than one of his writings in insulting people at enormous length. And you thought anybody as intelligent and sensible as Marx would have thought this was a waste of time. And Herr Vogt is an example of that. An even more striking example is the German ideology, written in 1845, where he the beginning of the German ideology is one of the, I think, the most important things he ever wrote about historical materialism. But then it goes on, for about 400 pages, or 300 maybe, lambasting one of his erstwhile colleagues called Stirner, Max Stirner, who had, and this is too complicated to go into at the moment, I think, but Stirner's very odd anarchist book called The Ego in Its Own had caught Marx, I think, on the raw, because Stirner had said Marx is a follower of Feuerbach, and is liable to the same criticism as Feuerbach is. And Marx, I think, was really galled by this, because there was a certain amount of truth in it. So he went on for 300 pages, lambasting this in a terribly turgid kind of manner. Who wants to read this kind of stuff? This poor man Stirner. But it's of course also true that Marx is a person who was very irascible, difficult to get along with, didn't suffer fools gladly, as a lot of very intelligent people don't. And so I'm sure this is part of the reason. But on occasion he went to such long lengths to lambast people quite unnecessarily. But you must think there's something slightly more behind it than that.
Right. My final question is, what do you see as being the ultimate purpose of Marx's writings and political work? And is that purpose useful to us today as we struggle with constructing our society?
Well, yes, there's two questions there. I mean, the ultimate purpose of Marx's work was to, I think, uncover the way in which history moved, to try and find, as to some extent Engels said in his speech over Marx's grave, Darwin has uncovered, the key to the evolution, the biological evolution of the human species. Marx has uncovered, according to Engels that is, the laws of history. And I think one of the things that Marx felt he had done was, by means of his ideas about historical materialism, about the economic basis of society, about the most important thing being who owned and who did not own the means of production, and that the ensuing class struggle between those who did own the means of production, those who didn't, and the way in which you could map this through history from very primitive societies through Greek and Roman society, through feudalism to capitalism to eventually socialism and then communism, that this provided a kind of map of a historical evolution that Marx felt that he himself had uncovered, and that he himself had uncovered also the way in which the growing working class in his time would be, just as the bourgeoisie had succeeded the feudal class in feudal society to create a bourgeois society, so the growing working class in his own time would be in a position to create a socialist and then a communist society. Now that's what Marx thought he had done.
Yes.
Now the second part of your question is, what can we learn from this? I think what we can learn from this is this, that one of Marx's most famous sayings, which I think is engraved on his gravestone in Highgate Cemetery, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, says, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. So Marx was very much a political revolutionary figure who wanted to change the world. Now, unfortunately, in my view, over the last 100 and more years since Marx died, I think his interpretation of the world, in terms of his views about ideology, where do ideas come from, whose interests do they serve, and that kind of idea of class conflict, and never taking at face value what the powers that be say about themselves, and their appeal particularly to moral principles of one sort or another, is as valid as it ever was, in this sense, Marx is one of the three masters of suspicion, together with Nietzsche and with Freud. Both Nietzsche and Freud are telling us, if people talk about liberty and equality and fraternity, ask what lies underneath this. Now, for Nietzsche and Freud, there are other, the will to power or infantile sexuality or what it may be, but for Marx, it is economic interest in one sort or another, preserving economic and therefore political and legal power. And I think that kind of idea is as valid as ever, even more so, I think, more so probably. The problem, of course, is that changing the world.
Yes.
I mean, Marx's followers, and they have changed the world, certainly, but not always for the better. I mean, if we look at the history of the Soviet Union, the history of communist China, which is still ongoing, I mean, you can take different views about this, and I think the negative view that a lot of people have, the very negative view about these sorts of things, is not justified. And these regimes have changed their societies, sometimes much for the better, but not along the lines that Marx had foreseen at all. So the advent of a socialist society, in terms of what socialism puts on its banners in a proper communist society, according to Marx, towards the end of his life, that is, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, is as far from being realised as it ever was, I think. Actually, even further these days, given the demise of the welfare state in this country. So I would split it up into those two ways. I think the analysis of Marx, the way he's asking us to look, in order to find out what is really going on in society, to
look
try to
underneath.
demystify, the kinds of ideology and propaganda and sound bites that go along, is absolutely on the ball. But the ways in which this kind of thing can be changed, unfortunately, are as obscure as ever. Let me just say one final thing, and that is one of the things that Marx, I think, didn't take sufficiently account of. He did take some account of it, is ecology and environmental politics. And what looks to a lot of us at the moment is that the current state of affairs in the world, economic expansion, is not viable. Now, it may well be that Marx's ideas for changing society are actually going to be, as it were, rescued by environmental questions. Because if capitalism needs constant economic expansion to continue to be viable, which is right, if it doesn't expand, it dies. And if the resources in the world at the moment are finite, as it would appear they are, global warming set aside for the moment, just that, then it may be that the world will have to think about different ways of organising society. In which case, some of Marx's ideas may well become slightly more relevant than they appear to be right at the moment.
He has that line in Capital about the two people who are oppressed by capitalism being the soil and the worker.
Yes, I mean, yes, he does. I mean, people might think that Marx has nothing to say about the ecological, but he does, as you say. I mean, he talks about the rape of the, that's not his word, but something like that, of the soil, by capitalism, and how it just creates these kind of dust bowls and that kind of thing. So he is slightly before his time, it has to be said there.
Okay, thank you very much for talking with me.
That's my pleasure.